Howard, thank you so much for joining us on the National Defense Podcast Show. It's wonderful to have you here today.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Very excited.
And I know it's your first time here on the show, so hopefully we'll be able to get you back so you could share more with our audience about information warfare, because there's a lot to unpack on that subject. And just to provide a little bit of context for our audiences, the NDU's College of Information and Cyberspace offers a Master's of Science in Strategic Information and Cyberspace, and your concentration falls under that Master's of Science. So Howard, before we learn more about the concentration, can you share a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Sure. I've been 27 years in the business, if you will, which is more of a, it's not necessarily something you rest your laurels on, because it's not something that we're known strategically to do very well. So it's more admitting something rather than it being a form of showing off or a form of self-praise. So I started off at a very, very junior level at the U.S. Information Agency back in the 1990s, and then through the Marine Corps, Department of Homeland Security, Special Operations Command, and now here at National Defense University, focusing on what we call today influence warfare.
Well, thank you for the background there. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about the courses you've taught here and some of the research you've done here? I know you've got a few books that you've written since arriving as well.
Yeah, so I've been focusing my research, and mainly everything I write, everything I publish is for the students primarily in mind. And I hope it gets an audience of those interested in national security beyond our students, but ultimately that's what it is. So very much my philosophy, and also just my simple mind, if you will, is teach what I write, write what I teach, publish and then teach, or then teach something and then eventually come up with enough ideas to publish, if you will. So kind of having that, forcing all of us, I hope, to continue to innovate and to take in new research into account, all that kind of stuff for our courses. So yeah.
And if I can follow up with that, maybe you could just kind of tell us about your concentration. So kind of like maybe the ins and out of what someone who is signed up for that concentration will get in terms of instruction.
Well, it's been a lot of fun. It's been, the concentration has gone for 5 years. And it includes just 2 courses. So up until now, it will be including more, and it has included more before. But let's say last year, for example, 2024, it included just 2 courses. One is called Influence Warfare in the fall. We're focused on grand strategic influence strategy. And then in the spring, we have the option, of course, for students to kind of go the high road, the U.S. role and road, I should say, U.S. allies role, which is very much truth, trust, and transparency. That's not my experience, so that's why we study subversion, sabotage, and subterfuge, and what it's called is just that. And so it's focused on sort of the dark arts of influence. Never for the United States to do, ever, but it's us be able to observe and to be able to stem or collapse or undermine foreign malign efforts.
Given that your concentration is focused on understanding these things, maybe tell us a little bit about what that looks like so we can kind of have a sneak peek
Sure.
for those who are interested. What does victory in the context of influence warfare look like, so we can have a better understanding of what these adversaries may be trying to achieve?
Sure. So it definitely, the way that we study influence within this concentration, which is certainly not the only way to study influence, not the only way to read on influence, not the only way to understand influence, but the way that we come about it, and of course students will bring their own experiences and have their own creative ideas, but we start by looking at influence as a phenomenon that supersedes, if you will, or cuts through and across all of dime or diplomacy, information, military, and the economy or economics. And so much like strategy, it really is about attaining whatever that objective is. So in a war, it could very well mean, a victory or some kind of an armistice. in great power competition, it could very well be furthering U.S. and her partner's national interest and stemming malign influence in a sustained type of way. So it is about reaching that end state with extreme prejudice. Of course, we're focusing on the non-kinetic side of how to do that, the indirect, the non-kinetic, the bottom-up side of things. It doesn't mean that we do this instead, the top of the kinetic or the top-down. It's just that you do it in addition. And you've seen that whether it's in something that nears absolute warfare, from the sacking of Baghdad to the taking of the Philippines by the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy, or whether it's, or if you look at the Cold War, the eventual sort of ideological and economic, perhaps, collapse of the Soviet Union and the decades that went into that. But ultimately, for sort of the near-term objective, it's behavior changed or behavior unchanged. So that's what we're focused on. We're not focused on opinions, because very often beliefs don't reflect actual opinions, and actions don't reflect beliefs necessarily, or professed beliefs. So we measure it, we start by looking at what's the impact, or what's a measure of impact for either behavior changed or behavior unchanged of human beings. So it could be a civil society group, it could be an individual, it could be a government, and then how do we plan backwards from there to make sure that we have that desired change.
That's incredibly relevant. And can you share just some of your favorites, or what students loved, some of the concept and information warfare that you go over in that course?
Sure. Conceptually, we use a number of frameworks that are helpful. The students will develop their own frameworks and theories which will help them most. And all of the theories and the frameworks that we talk about are then tested in the field by our graduates. And so we have graduates, we have a number of Ukrainian students that have taken the concentration or in the Ukraine, providing real-time feedback on a non-sensitive level, of course. We have folks, again, going to unstable or stable areas and applying these kind of frameworks. And so I get to have the great opportunity, the honor to continue talking with these folks and saying, hey, what's forgettable, what's helpful, and what's hurtful on what we've taught. So we want to make things relevant. But frameworks, in theories, even though, it sounds very academic, if it's applicable, if it's actionable, if it's intrepid enough, then I find that it can be very practical. So the type of things that we look at is we study the concept or the phenomenon of the subconscious mind, and what we would call the limbic system phenomenon as well, as part of that and also separate to that. And so as the approximate targets of much, not all, but much of influence warfare, because again, it's sort of this insensible, indirect means. Influence being in effect without formal power, without formal authority, without force, by indirect or insensible means. So it's unseen, it's unheard, it's indirect, as opposed to like something like direct persuasion. So we learn a lot about, again, the subconscious mind and the limbic system mind, impulses that we're born with, and then things that we pick up in our early years that develop sort of our world views and how we think about things. And how we can gain, with the subconscious, any kind of influence campaign, that's really where you're going to gain your traction. It's where you're going to gain your hook. It's where you're, sort of the starting point of any kind of a campaign, is understanding that. And so there's a number of models that we do use, from neuroscience to anthropology or neuroanthropology, and a number of other, disciplines across to try to look at how do we sort of, if you will, hack the subconscious, which is the name of the second lesson. Then from there, we offer a number of frameworks about ways to ethically, openly, again, through truth, trust, and transparency, to leverage, to empower, to enable certain networks and narratives across the world to be, again, to reach their end state that happens to be in consonance with the end state of our interest, or the interest of the country, of the student from which he or she comes. So that would be like So one of them is, for example, looking at like network analysis within autocratic regimes, and how sometimes just the very connectivity with different sects within civil society can spread that enemy intelligence and security apparatus thin, or there can be sort of internal, very subtle sabotage of what they're doing. It could very well be a youth group network in some area. It could be a group of corporate leaders speaking out against Chinese bad investments. It could be a number of indigenous rights folks, again, speaking out against Chinese investments overseas. It could be even a number of governments. It's not just non-government entities in civil society. It could be different government entities. So the types of things that we look at is we look at the sort of hypotheses about how societies innovate. There's a number of those. We look at a craft called consonance and resonance, where you try to find consonant networks overseas whose end states sort of jibe with U.S. end states at that point in time. And then what are ethical, moral, through our values way that those systems, again, can be, that we can resonate, if using music theory and physics, if you will, as an analogy, and to amplify those native network narratives, if you will.
That is fascinating. It's no wonder your course is one of the most highly enrolled
I would know
at
that, yeah.
CIC.
Well, thanks for the concepts and your description of some of the frameworks. It's especially nice to hear that being a part of your class allows students to explore their own ideas as part of their own method for building frameworks for further study. I'd like to ask about how social media and influencers kind of are thought about in your course, if at all. Being an influencer is a full-blown profession at this point, and so my kids have their favorite influencer, and so but there are some ethics behind that, especially when you start talking about the government kind of doing some sort of analysis on people within the U.S. population. But that's a force to be reckoned with, right? Because everyone who is on social media, especially those who are most influential, are able to shape narratives rather quickly because they have a lot of people who follow them. So, how are in the domestic context, if at all, influencers are thought about, and also internationally as well, as something to be studied as part of your coursework?
Yeah, I think that again, I'm lucky in that I focus my entire career outside the United States on things that don't affect inside the United States. Certainly some of the research is very interesting, but this is not research I necessarily do, but I can read other colleagues about sort of the influencer mentality, the influencer business, or the influence cottage industry in the United States, which is becoming much more difficult because it's just a saturated field, but to actually turn a profit on that, the few people that are lucky to do that, they're very interesting concepts, and they're similar overseas from what I understand. But looking overseas where I do, whether it's Northern Africa or Southeast Asia, a lot of time influencers can influence really only online. They can perhaps push products about things that are not already near and dear to the listeners' hearts, or they've already found a welcome audience of people. So certainly we can't talk about influence without talking about technology, without talking about social media, without talking about other means of communications, whether it's gaming, whether it's across social media platforms, etc. What we find is as the world becomes much more focused on, let's say, online disinformation and social media disinformation, for example, that if you look at the amount of money, time, personnel, and effort that U.S. competitor governments put into online influence, it's really almost nothing compared to what they do in real life influence. And so in many ways, it points up the importance of the real, what I would call real world influence. A lot of the online influencers, they might, maybe they suddenly have an opinion about this or that leader overseas, but that's not necessarily going to get their audience to change behavior. At most, it might communicate where to be and when to be. If there's going to be a protest or something like that, it's been used for that. It's also been used by governments to track those individuals in some autocratic regimes. But in general, as a single, radicalizing avenue, it's rare that that's just going to be, sort of on its own, although that does certainly happen. So whether we're talking about it because it's specifically offline, or we're talking about, real world influencers, people that can actually, they themselves, or can influence folks within their communities, outside their communities, in their government, et cetera, perhaps across borders and regions, that can be a very different thing than those kind of online persona influencers. And so an example would be, if you look overseas, when there was a rollout for vaccines, that sometimes you would have maybe an athlete or an actor overseas. Again, I know this happened in the U.S., but I'm focused more overseas. Would say, "Hey, it's painless. It's important. I talked to my doctor about this. Talk to your doctor about this, and we think it's a good idea that you have that chat and you think about getting that." And what we found was people would listen to them not very much, but they would. So if it was a famous, let's say, soccer star in Latin America, or if it's a famous handball star or ballet artist, then that's really where that sort of zone is where the influence is going to be. There is some interesting sort of tactics and techniques and procedures which a lot of students will bring up and we'll talk about. Things like people renting out their Twitter accounts. And this has been going on for a long time, since the beginning of Twitter. People renting out their YouTube accounts. This has been going on since the creation of YouTube. So you have a lot of followers, you rent it out to a foreign government or a foreign agent, usually not knowing that's who that is. Again, this happens, what I focus is overseas, not in the United States. And in this case, not in the Americas. And the idea is to continue down the line of whatever that influencer has been saying, and then sort of sew in ideas about like politics and political ideas to try to get people to change their mind. But even that we find doesn't necessarily work that well. But there's a lot of attempts and there's focus on it, even if it's not the main focus, again, on personnel, time, funding.
Yeah, so your point earlier, with 2 points, thank you for that answer. 2 points that you brought up. One, you talked about renting out social media, and you might not know that it's for some sort of government entity. And so, and I'm thinking back earlier to your example about where you kind of alluded to great power, where you talked about like the Soviet context, back in the Cold War kind of period. What kinds of ways do you talk about present day influence warfare with great power competition? That term is, it's replete in the text here the last few years, and so. How do students wrestle with, and how do you kind of talk through influence warfare in the present day context with the great power competition?
Yeah, so thank you for asking that. Our starting point is case studies that become war games or workshops. That's what these courses are, like 90% war games or workshops. And so we use real world case studies. Some are ongoing. So it could be Confucius Institutes overseas, where a government is trying to shutter those Confucius Institutes, much in the way the U.S. shuttered most of its Confucius Institutes. And this, is working with, discussing how you work with teachers' unions, you work with student groups of different faith groups, different political stripes, investors, different politicians, et cetera, and how that occurs. And we look at foreign elections on, whether there's interference or lack of interference, or, lessons learned from that kind of thing. So that's our starting point, because it is difficult in, today's world is ever more complex, and what is great power competition as far as, is the goal, maintaining status quo, maintaining stability throughout the world? Is the goal stemming malign influence in a general sense? Well, whatever the mission is, we want the students to have basically gone through war games, battle games, if you will, so that when they graduate, they're able to face the real thing, which they're going to be a part of very soon. So we'll also use historical examples. And the reason that we use historical examples is obviously technology is different now, but I find that since it's unlikely the human brain has changed a lot in the last 70,000 years, we find that case studies from 100 years ago, from 10 years ago, from 20 years ago, they can still be very, very helpful. So we'll look at things like the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, during World War II. We'll look at the Comanche in that sort of 250-year period and how they gained territory against the Spanish, the Mexicans, settlers, Texas Rangers, and the U.S. Army. We look at U.S. and Vatican support to the Solidarity movement in Poland, and part of the Warsaw Pact, part of the Eastern Bloc, if you will. We look at and a number of modern violent extremist groups that are funded by governments abroad, and what's actually happening, what has worked, what has not worked. But I think it's very important that you do, that we spend time on these real world examples, because again, we want to ensure the frameworks are always very closely relatable or actionable, or something that they can do once they graduate. And so like one of the things they do is their final assignment, final written assignment, is what I call a tradecraft primer. And so they will take 5 concepts from the course that they believe that would be important in their career, and they will describe exactly what they will do in their career with those 5 concepts. Looking 1 year out, 5 years out, 10 years out, hopefully more in some cases. And the idea is once they graduate is they have this, sort of 2-page primer, or I should say 1 sheet of paper, front and back, primer of the main sort of takeaways, that what they found valuable and effective in the course. So those frameworks that are then taken through these case studies, these war games, in the form of war games and workshops, and then they have something not only for themselves, but they also have something to talk about, something to brief or do a period of instruction. So in a way, it's kind of influencing the influencers that influence influencers. So the idea is, that it was a pretty easy idea actually, and it was really the students' ideas, because what was happening is I've been teaching different versions of this course on and off for a number of years, even when I was an operator, an analyst, an intelligence officer, as a commander as well, also on staff, on planning, that when somebody hears, so when I've done a course like influence warfare or like subversion, subterfuge, sabotage, that when the student graduates and someone says, hey, how was your time at NDU? Oftentimes they want to bring that up because it's exciting. It sounds cool, because it is. It's a lot of fun. And so when they say something like, I took a course called influence warfare, or I took a course called subversion and sabotage, almost immediately their new commanding officer or director is going to be like, I want a briefing on that. And then so for a number of years, I worked with graduates on creating hundreds and hundreds of these things with them. And I said, why don't you do that? Why don't we do that during the semester? That way, when you graduate and you walk across with that degree, walk across the stage at the end of the academic year with that degree, you have something that you can actually use in an immediate way. And part of it is the creativity of taking these frameworks to exactly what they're, to apply to what they're going to be doing. And so this is also a way to focus students continuously throughout the semester from framework into action within great power competition, specifically the battle space that we are living and breathing in. And it could be that, hey, this is going to help me be a better leader. Oftentimes it's that. Most often is this is going to help me be able to use influence within planning within strategy itself. And so one thing that we found with the modern case studies from the 20th century and ancient case studies or more ancient case studies, is that they are often conducted by people that do not have a background in information operations or public diplomacy or psychological operations. They're great influencers because they're great leaders. So no matter what you do, whether it's logistics, whether you're a pilot, whether you're an intelligence officer, whether you work transportation, whether you work agriculture, influence is something that they can apply in a very practical way, not only to their career, but into furthering their mission that they are a part of.
And Howard, I think that's brilliant, because in so many classes, you finish the course, the students leave, they become alumni, and then they are left to think about how you apply what you have learned in your area of operations. But in this particular case, you're actually able to do that while you're in that academic environment. You can talk with your fellow classmates, with your instructor, and already do that brainstorming while you're still in the course. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, no, thanks for saying that. And they are encouraged to be ruthlessly selfish in what they wrote, so that it's helpful. Yeah.
You know, one thing that I remember getting from you when I first arrived was the link to your podcast, and you had a whole library of things that you've already kind of discussed and kind of gone through with your students. So maybe tell us a little bit about your podcast, and then maybe, if you will, something about either the books you've written, numerous books you've written, or the textbooks you've used for your classes, so that folks can have a kind of a read ahead. Sure. If you will. Yeah.
Well, the first thing I want to do is apologize. So the podcasts are great if you have extreme insomnia. Also, you should not be using heavy equipment while listening to the podcast. I am not a professional podcaster. I only did them. I only do them because I wanted to cut down on the reading time of the students. Yeah. That way they can listen and prepare for the lesson when they're commuting or when they're waiting in carpool traffic at their kid's school, something like that, or cleaning around the house, etc. If I can make that a little easier, that's great. I try to look as many video essays as well, where the audio is the most important part of that. And then something I've used in the past as sort of a supplement to readings, videos, and podcasts that are relatively short is I've written primers, and now those primers for each course and each lesson in some cases are becoming sort of like textbooks, as in it provides, I hope, some guiding ideas that will help the student get through the course more easily, if you will. The focus is on saving time before the lesson, because once the lesson starts, it's like, a thunderdome of ideas, of horrible ideas and great ideas. It's a lot of fun. It's a place for intellectual courage. It's a place to bring the wildest ideas possible, because we can talk about them here. So that way they go out in the real world, or back out in the real world, once they graduate, that they've had a chance to really, intellectually grow and be curious as much as they want to be, and that's very, very important. So anything I can do to sort of, once you come into that classroom, I like to leave the learning inside the classroom as much as possible. So again, the podcast, the primers, the textbooks, outside readings, of course, they're all meant to hopefully save the students some time.
Any final kind of thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with about your anything about your teaching, your research, maybe things you're working on in the future, or anything you'd like to kind of close this out with?
Let me think.
So much.
No. I think that it's one great thing about the concentration, and I think this is one of the many, many wonderful things about National Defense University, is that these concentration students want to take these courses. And to have that kind of energy, to go in that room, is the most incredible thing. And our job, as you guys know much better than I do, and do much better than I do, is we are facilitators of adult education. We are not typical teachers. So whether I'm doing a workshop or a war game, or I'm showing a video, we have an entire lesson on film as propaganda, for example. So what are we going to do? we're going to watch film clips, of course, because how can you have a lesson on film and not watch films? That the students want to be there, and well, it has to be a lot of fun. It has to be a lot of energy. It has to be a lot of fun. Students want to be there. It's very obvious that students want to be there in these particular lessons. Again, up until recently, it's the concentration with the fewest courses, but by course, it's the largest concentration in NDU history by course, outside of the American Studies program. And but again, it's not a lot of courses inside the concentration, and so the idea that everyone is just earnestly wants to be there, and it's a matter of ensuring that they have this Thunderdome, they have this place, again, where they can be curious and they can grow intellectually as much as they want to.
Well, Howard, thank you so much for being with us today, and we very much look forward to your next podcast.
Thanks, appreciate it.
And as well as looking forward to hearing from your students in the future and what they create.
That'd be awesome.
Absolutely.